We're ready, Mr. Don.
Good morning. Our devotional this morning is found in 1 John chapter 2, verses 15 through 17, and is titled, The Things of the World. Now please turn to 1 John chapter 2 and let's read verse 15 through 17 together. Now, eat, drink, and be merry, says the world, for tomorrow we die. Well, the world is half right. Tomorrow we die. Now suppose you were to die tomorrow. How would your obituary read? Now just pause and think about it for a moment. Now, having considered your potential obituary, answer this question. How much of my obituary pertains to God's kingdom? C.T. Studd, who was one of the greatest missionaries ever, answered this question with an excerpt from a poem that he had written. Quote, only one life, and soon 'tis past. Only what's done for Christ will last. And now with this in mind, how many obituaries do you believe are written in sand? Sadly, worldliness, that is the love of the things of this world, has rendered many professing Christians ineffective. The Bible speaks plainly about the dangers of a worldly heart. Adulterers and adulteresses, says James, do you not know that friendship with the world is enmity with God? Put another way, the world hates God, and those who befriend the world become God's enemies. And furthermore, worldliness makes people focus on outward things rather than inward things. And by having this focus, people ignore God's kingdom within themselves, which results in Satan's gaining prime opportunities to drag their souls into the pit of eternity. And this reminds us of Lazarus and rich man and Lazarus. Now, one last point from the book of James, chapter 4, verse 4. In this verse, James does not speak of God's attitude toward the believer. Rather, the believer's attitude toward God. Mm-hmm. The difference between the world and God is so vast that when we move toward the world and all of its worldly things, we alienate ourselves from God. So how does this happen? In the world, sin is considered acceptable and pleasurable. And ultimately, believers lose their awareness of sin, and thus sin becomes habitual. Now, James' concern is not for occasional sins, but for the attitude of the heart that leads a person to turn his back on God and his face to the world. And so rather than knowing sin by observation or personal experience, we as Christians are supposed to use our God-given mind to discern good from evil without tasting of evil itself. And so the crucial point here for us is when we become friends with the world, we alienate ourselves from God. Now the good news is our Bibles give us the key for overcoming worldliness, but it all boils down to what we set our hearts on. For example, in Colossians chapter 3, verse 2, Paul tells us, set your mind or affections on things above, not on things on this earth. And if we allow Jesus to reign in our hearts, then we will dwell on the spiritual world and not on the world around us. Let's read that again. And if we allow Jesus to reign in our hearts, then we will dwell on the spiritual world and not on the world around us. And now in closing, 1 Thessalonians 5:17 reminds us that we are to pray constantly. So let's begin today and every day hereafter with asking God, number one, to search our hearts for any worldly ways that may separate us from Him. Two, then confess those areas to God and ask Him for forgiveness. And three, and then ask Him to show us how we can set our mind and heart on the things above. Amen.
Amen.